Leonardo Montenegro was never the kind of man to let chance dictate any aspect of his life. At 35, he was already considered one of the most feared and admired businessmen in the country, known both for his coldness in business and his emotional distance from anyone who dared to get closer than strictly necessary. Born into wealth but raised amidst tragedies that shaped his view of the world, Leonardo grew up with a single certainty engraved in his mind. Love was a dangerous illusion, a weakness capable of destroying empires and ruining lives. He had witnessed this firsthand with his own father, a magnate who, after falling hopelessly in love, lost everything to emotional bets and irrational decisions, dragging the entire family into ruin. From a very young age, Leonardo swore he would never make the same mistake. To him, everything needed clear terms, solid clauses, and safety margins. His emotional life, or the lack thereof, was governed by a symbolic document he had his lawyer draft. A contract committing himself to never emotionally engage with anyone. That piece of paper, hidden in the safe of his private library, was more than a reminder. It was a silent oath reinforcing what he believed to be his greatest strength: the absence of any vulnerability. His mansion, located in the city's most noble outskirts, reflected his soul perfectly: cold, immaculate, meticulously organized. The long, silent hallways seemed to echo his firm steps, and the staff, highly trained, knew exactly how to maintain the environment just the way he liked it: functional, efficient, and above all, impersonal. Leonardo was the architect of his own solitude, and although, on particularly quiet nights, a certain emptiness threatened to emerge in his consciousness, he would quickly silence it with appointments, numbers, and transactions. It was amidst this perfectly calculated routine that something, or rather, someone, disrupted the cycle. Without his direct authorization, as he had delegated the household management to a prestigious staffing agency, a new hire was made: a young woman to assist with the simpler tasks of the mansion, something he deemed too irrelevant to require his personal attention. Little did he know that this small, seemingly insignificant change would be the first crack in his carefully built fortress. The morning Leonardo learned about the new employee began like any other. The subtle aroma of fresh coffee filled the air as he reviewed quarterly financial reports. An almost imperceptible sound, timid footsteps on the polished marble of the hall, caught his attention. Lifting his eyes over his reading glasses, he saw Helena Vasconcellos for the first time. Small, dressed simply, with eyes carrying more dreams than experiences, she appeared as an imperfection in the cold, perfect canvas he had so diligently crafted. Leonardo frowned, bothered not so much by her presence, but by the strange feeling her image provoked deep inside him. A sense of something displaced, out of place, like a simple piece threatening to reconfigure the entire board. He turned his gaze back to the papers, deciding to ignore her. After all, she was just another maid. Unimportant, out of place in his hermetic world. Yet not even Leonardo Montenegro, with all his rigidity, could imagine that this small distraction would be just the first step towards something far greater. Something that not even his contracts, his rules, or his inner walls would be able to contain. As he struggled to refocus on his spreadsheets, he had no idea that with each timid step Helena took inside that house, an invisible thread was slowly and inevitably weaving their fates together, pulling him towards a path he had sworn never to follow. Helena Vasconcellos was not the kind of woman who would immediately catch anyone's attention amidst the luxury and opulence of the Montenegro mansion. Her beauty was subtle, almost hidden beneath the simplicity of her worn clothes and the timid way she walked, as if afraid to occupy more space than she was allowed. Yet there was something about her that defied appearances, a silent light, a hope almost palpable that clashed brutally with the immaculate coldness of that place. When Helena crossed the imposing gates of the property for the first time, she felt small, misplaced, almost like an intruder in a world that had not been made for her. But there was also a silent determination in her brown eyes. She could not, under any circumstance, fail. The daughter of humble farmers and motherless from a young age, Helena had learned early that no one would come to save her. The need to support her 3 younger siblings had forced her to leave school early, dedicating herself to manual labor and odd jobs that appeared in the small town where she grew up. Reading and writing were skills she possessed only in the most rudimentary form. learned through furtive nights after long workdays, struggling to decipher old, discarded books, or those received through charity. Accepting the job at the Montenegro estate was an act of both courage and desperation. She lacked the qualifications but trusted that hard work and honesty would be enough to compensate for her deficiencies. Her first impression among the other employees was mixed. Some looked at her with disdain, bothered by her lack of polish. Others viewed her with barely concealed pity. In that house where every gesture, every word, every glance was measured as part of a silent dance of power, Helena's spontaneity seemed like an off-key note. Inevitably, it drew the attention of the one person she most feared to disappoint, Leonardo Montenegro himself. Their first encounter was brief, almost brutal in its intensity. Carrying a silver tray with coffee cups, Helena failed to notice that Leonardo had changed his usual morning route through the corridors. Distracted by the sheer size of the mansion, she almost collided with him. The impact didn't happen, but the tray trembled in her hands, causing one of the saucers to slip and shatter on the floor, the sound echoing like gunshots through the solemn silence of the house. Leonardo, standing tall before her, looked down with a chilling coldness that froze Helena's blood in her veins. For long seconds, only the ticking of the wall clock filled the space between them. Helena, fighting the impulse to shrink back or stammer an apology, steadied herself, quickly kneeling to gather the shards. Her trembling hands betrayed her nervousness, but her eyes, when they dared to meet his, held an unexpected firmness, as if silently declaring that, though small in this world, she would not be crushed. Leonardo, accustomed to employees who barely dared to meet his gaze, was momentarily disconcerted, a fact he would never admit. Without a word, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Helena kneeling on the cold marble, gathering not only the fragments of the saucer, but also the first cracks beginning to form inside him. From that day on, Leonardo noticed her more than he wished. He saw her silent steps down the corridors, her effort to memorize tasks, her hidden difficulty when dealing with written lists, her attentive eyes trying to capture instructions she did not always understand immediately. He watched everything from a distance without interfering, but with a growing curiosity that gnawed at his invisible armor. Something in Helena's restrained vulnerability, in her humble strength in facing what she clearly did not master, disturbed him in ways he could not name. Helena, for her part, lived in a constant state of alert. She knew her position was fragile, that a single mistake could cost her the job and the survival of her siblings. Every task felt like walking through a minefield, every new order a test of courage. There were nights she curled up in her small maid's room, fighting back tears, wondering if she would survive in such a hostile environment. Yet every morning, she would rise, take a deep breath, and return to the silent battle of proving she belonged there. The inevitable would come when a more serious mistake, one impossible to hide, would place Helena directly in Leonardo's line of fire, igniting a tension that would change the fate of both in ways neither could foresee. That gray morning, destiny was preparing to strike its first decisive blow. Helena had risen earlier than usual, as she often did when the weight of her responsibilities threatened to crush her. The muffled sound of rain outside seemed to echo her growing anxiety. She moved silently, carefully adjusting her simple uniform, and made her way through the mansion's long corridors, guided only by the faint light filtering through the tall windows. That day, her task seemed simple in theory. Organize Mr. Montenegro's private library, a room whispered among the staff to be sacred, almost untouchable. It was there that Leonardo kept his secrets, his contracts, his unbreakable deals with destiny. Helena entered the room with the reverence of someone stepping onto forbidden ground. The scent of aged leather from the old books mixed with the sweet varnish aroma of the dark wood furniture. Her hands, though chilled by the morning air, moved delicately, dusting the shelves, arranging the heavy volumes, struggling not to make a single mistake. The tension in her shoulders was so intense that she barely noticed the passing time. Everything seemed under control until, reaching for the highest shelf, her trembling fingers brushed against a small wooden box nestled discreetly among the books. The box toppled. In a desperate reflex, Helena tried to catch it, but it was useless. It crashed to the floor, spilling papers that slid across the polished marble like leaves blown by the wind. The sound, though muted by the vastness of the house, echoed in Helena's ears like thunder. Panicking, she dropped to her knees to gather the contents, but what she saw froze her in place. Personal documents, contracts, letters, all meticulously organized, and among them, a sheet distinctly titled, Emotional Renunciation Contract. She couldn't read fluently, but she recognized enough words to understand that this was not just important, it was intimate, forbidden. As her hands hovered over the papers, a shadow darkened the floor before her. Helena's heart leapt into her throat before she even dared to look up. Leonardo was there, standing motionless in the doorway, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that seemed to carve the air between them. For an endless moment, time stood still. The expression on his face was not mere anger. It was something deeper, more dangerous, a mixture of fury and exposed vulnerability. The silence that followed weighed heavily on both of them. Helena, her eyes stinging with unshed tears, stammered an apology she could barely articulate. She tried to gather the papers, but her hands shook so violently she could hardly grasp them. Leonardo then moved with firm steps, seized the documents brusquely from her trembling hands, and snapped the box shut with a sharp sound that resonated across the silent room. Without raising his voice, but with a chill sharper than ice, he ordered Helena to leave the library immediately. His voice, firm and cutting, sounded like an unappealable sentence. Choking with shame, Helena bowed awkwardly and fled, stumbling through the doorway, struggling to hold back the tears burning behind her eyes. Her entire body trembled, not only from fear of punishment, but from the terrible sensation of having violated something far greater than a physical space. She had trespassed into the silent heart of Leonardo Montenegro, a place where no one was permitted to enter. As she hurried up the service stairs, her face burning with humiliation, Helena could not know that behind the closed library doors, Leonardo remained standing, staring into the void, as if the fall of that box had somehow broken open not only his secrets, but the first cracks of a fortress he had spent a lifetime building. And it was through these very cracks that the inevitable would begin to seep in, slowly and relentlessly, leading to the moment when Helena, without even realizing it, would be summoned once again to cross the path of the man who had sworn himself invulnerable. The following day dawned under a sky painted in shades of gray, with a cold wind that seemed to herald invisible changes. Helena woke early, as she always did, but the weight of shame and fear made every movement slower, heavier. Her body still carried the tension from the humiliation she had endured in the library, and her restless mind could not push away the image of Leonardo Montenegro's gaze, that mixture of fury and something deeper she could not quite define. Even so, she forced herself to dress neatly, tie her hair back carefully, and descend, knowing that each step she took that day would be a silent test of her resilience. As she carried out her tasks, her senses felt heightened to the extreme. Every sound, every whisper among the other employees, every furtive glance seemed a veiled threat. There was a tension in the air, as if the whole house was bracing for something to happen. Helena avoided the main corridors, steering clear of places where she might cross paths with the master, and yet she could not shake the feeling of being watched, scrutinized at every turn. The fear of dismissal loomed over her, a real and palpable threat. The salary that sustained her brothers now hung by a fragile thread. By late morning, the summons came. One of the housekeepers, wearing a grave expression, instructed Helena to present herself at Mr. Montenegro's office. The world seemed to spin around her. Her legs nearly gave way beneath her, but she took a deep breath, lifted her head, and walked forward, knowing she could not avoid the inevitable. The office was a place few dared to enter. The heavy wooden doors stood slightly ajar, the cold, impersonal light spilling out into the hallway. Helena hesitated for a moment at the threshold, her heart pounding wildly in her chest, then knocked gently to announce herself. Leonardo's voice, dry and controlled, summoned her inside. Crossing the threshold, Helena felt the oppressive weight of the atmosphere. Leonardo sat behind his massive mahogany desk, eyes fixed on a document he studied with exaggerated focus. For long seconds, he did not lift his gaze, as if determined to stretch the tension, to make her feel the full magnitude of her insignificance. When at last his eyes met hers, Helena felt the full force of his coldness solidify the very air she breathed. Leonardo, with surprising calm, asked if she understood the gravity of what she had done the day before. His voice was low, measured, but every word cut like a blade. Fighting to keep her composure, Helena admitted her mistake, insisting she had never intended to violate his privacy. Her voice was firm despite the fear gnawing at her from within. She offered no excuses. She knew hollow apologies would mean nothing to a man like him. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy and absolute. Then, against all expectations, Leonardo leaned back in his chair, and with a slight motion of his hand, beckoned her closer. Hesitantly, Helena advanced, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Standing before the desk, she felt his gaze shift, as if seeing something beyond her failure, something deeper than her inexperience. He spoke then, delivering words Helena would never have expected to hear. He asked if she wanted to learn. The question struck her like a silent thunderclap. Leonardo knew. He knew she could barely read. He knew her struggles were not carelessness, but the weight of an ignorance she bore silently. And yet, there he was, offering something beyond anything she could have dared to dream. A chance. Helena's mind reeled, struggling to comprehend what was happening. Searching his face for any hint of mockery or cruelty, she found none. Only a strange seriousness, a contained tension that blurred the lines between the cold master and a man perhaps already breaking his own rules without realizing it. And it was with that simple, disarming question that Leonardo Montenegro planted the seed of something that, quietly and inevitably, would begin to change everything between them. Something that neither contracts nor sworn promises of invulnerability would be able to stop. The library, once a forbidden territory, transformed into a silent field of discoveries and veiled tensions. Leonardo Montenegro, true to his reserved nature, made no grand speeches or explanations when he decided he would teach Helena himself. He merely gestured toward the armchair across from his desk, placed a simple book in her hands, and gave the first command. "Read." Helena, her eyes wide with apprehension, felt her throat tighten. The words blurred before her, a dance of confusing symbols. With a trembling voice she tried, stumbling over syllables, sounds, and pauses. Each mistake seemed to echo louder in the heavy silence, exposing her raw vulnerability before the man who embodied absolute control. Yet, contrary to Helena's fears, Leonardo did not humiliate her. His face remained impassive, analyzing each hesitant attempt with the same clinical detachment he reserved for examining contracts or financial reports. However, in his eyes, there was a faint, almost imperceptible spark. Something that suggested he was, perhaps for the first time in years, interested in something he could not measure, calculate, or dominate. Day after day, within that library where only shadows and silence had once lived, they met. Leonardo assigned her small passages to decode, patiently explained how letters joined to form words, corrected mistakes without raising his voice, guiding Helena along a hard yet meaningful path. Helena, for her part, threw herself into this new world with the hunger of someone who had always lived with a caged soul and was now feeling the first cracks of freedom. Each word she managed to form was an intimate victory, a step beyond the limits life had imposed on her. And in ways she did not fully understand, her confidence grew, not just in her learning, but also in Leonardo's presence. The glances exchanged between them, once filled with tension and mistrust, became silences heavy with hidden meanings. Sometimes, Helena would catch a faint smile at the corner of Leonardo's mouth, not a full smile, but a slight lift, as if he were struggling against something silently blossoming inside him. The lessons, meant to last minutes, often stretched into hours. Initially, they were purely practical. Reading, writing, comprehension. But over time, questions emerged, brief conversations, exchanges of ideas that stepped outside the formal structure. Leonardo began to share with Helena fragments of his own interests, bits of philosophy, ancient histories, concepts that seemed distant from her world but lit a spark of fascination in her eyes. And in this silent process, something invisible wove itself between them, a fragile, tenuous bond, built not from words, but from shared spaces and unspoken understandings. Yet, no matter how much they tried to ignore or deny it, the line between master and apprentice, employer and servant, once so rigid, began to blur. The more Leonardo tried to maintain the rigor of his methods and the coldness of his intentions, the more he found himself entangled in an emotion he had long forbidden. A genuine enchantment with the woman who, without artifice or design, dismantled his defenses with the persistence of a quiet breeze. And it was amidst this seemingly harmless routine, so tamed by the ritual of learning, that an innocent gesture, a spontaneous smile, a lingering glance, an unwary touch, would mark the beginning of the end for the invisible contract Leonardo had sworn never to break. It was just another afternoon, the kind where time seems to stretch between the silent walls of a house too large for its own secrets. Golden light filtered through the tall windows of the library, spilling over the dark furniture and creating small islands of warmth and clarity in an otherwise cold environment. Helena, seated at the reading table, read aloud softly, occasionally stumbling over more difficult words. Leonardo, a few steps away, pretended to concentrate on his papers, but in truth, every faltering syllable from Helena's lips sounded to him like the breath of a life he had forgotten existed. It was during one of these stumbles that everything changed. Frustrated after misreading yet another word, Helena let out a small, nervous laugh, bringing her hand to her forehead in a childlike gesture of embarrassment. That sound, so natural, so spontaneous in an environment suffocated by rules and rigidity, broke the invisible spell that had hovered between them for weeks. Leonardo, without thinking, looked at her, and, for the first time in what felt like forever, allowed his face to soften into a discreet, almost imperceptible but genuine smile. Helena, noticing the change in his expression, immediately blushed. Their eyes met for a moment too long, a moment when all the words that could have been spoken simply dissolved into the air, rendered unnecessary. In that suspended fragment of time, they were no longer master and servant, nor teacher and student. They were simply a man and a woman, vulnerable, touched by something so subtle that no written rule could ever forbid it. Not knowing how to act, Helena turned her attention back to the book, but her hands trembled slightly as she turned the page. Leonardo, fully aware of the shift that had just occurred between them, gathered his documents more forcefully than necessary, a futile attempt to regain control. His heart pounded wildly, betraying the silent battle raging within him. In the days that followed, small changes began to happen, almost imperceptible to anyone not paying close attention. The lessons became lighter, the smiles easier. Sometimes a silly question would make Helena laugh, and Leonardo laugh with her, as if the sound of happiness had become a secret language between them. The simple act of Helena reading an entire paragraph without mistake became a quiet celebration, a spark in her eyes that ignited something uncontrollable within him. It was during one of these afternoons, as the light began to fade, that Helena, in an absent-minded gesture, touched Leonardo's hand while showing him a new word she had learned. The touch was brief, almost nothing, but the electricity that shot through both of them was so intense that they immediately pulled back, as if burned. The book slipped from the table, landing on the floor with a sharp thud that sliced through the silence. Embarrassed, Helena quickly bent to pick up the book, but Leonardo stopped her with a firm hand on her shoulder. Their eyes met again, and the tension between them was nearly tangible, thick with the promise of an approaching storm. Leonardo realized with piercing clarity that he stood at the brink of something he could no longer control, something no contract or oath of distance could restrain. And it was with that terrifying and yet irresistible realization that Leonardo made the hardest decision of his life. He had to push her away. He had to reclaim the control he was rapidly losing, before what little protection he still had crumbled completely. Without saying a word, he rose, gathered his papers with the stiffness of someone rebuilding invisible walls, and, with a voice colder than ice, abruptly ended the day's lesson. Helena, still seated, confused and aching, could only watch as he left the library without looking back. She felt a deep, dull ache in her chest, sensing that something precious, something she could not even name, had begun to break between them. But it was not yet the end. No, destiny, always silent and patient, still had cards left to play. The days that followed were marked by an absence that seemed to scream through the corridors of the mansion. Leonardo kept to himself, burying his focus in business, hiding behind commitments and meetings that once came naturally, but now served only as a shield against the growing unrest consuming his thoughts. Helena, in turn, tried to maintain her routine, pretending at normalcy while her heart bled in silence. The distance he had imposed between them had become an abyss she no longer knew how to cross, and each evaded glance, each deliberate absence, was another wound deepening her quiet hopes. The lessons in the library ended abruptly, as if they had never existed. Helena returned to her duties, moving through the house almost unseen, cleaning, organizing, fading into the background. But inside her, a silent battle raged. Part of her wanted to forget, to pretend the fleeting brightness between them had been nothing. Yet another part, more stubborn, more honest, clung fiercely to the memory of exchanged glances, restrained smiles, and accidental touches that had ignited something within her that could no longer be extinguished. Leonardo, despite his impassive exterior, could not rid himself of Helena's image. In every meeting, every negotiation, her absence felt like a constant presence whispering doubts into his mind. What tormented him most was the simplicity of what he felt. There were no plans, no hidden interests. There was only a raw, overwhelming sensation that amidst the calculated chaos of his life, Helena was the only genuine thing he had encountered in years. And that realization terrified him. In a desperate attempt to regain control over himself, Leonardo intensified his work schedule. Still, the emptiness persisted, cold and unyielding. One night, unable to find peace within his usual routine, he wandered aimlessly through the mansion's hallways. His steps echoed off the walls, and the loneliness seemed to mock his attempts at self-preservation. Passing by the slightly open door of the library, he caught a glimpse of the interior, warmly illuminated by the soft glow of the fireplace, and froze. Inside the room, Helena knelt before the hearth, carefully tending the fire. Her movements were slow, almost reverent, as if she honored the space that carried so many silent memories. Leonardo remained hidden in the shadows, watching her in complete silence. The way her hair captured the light, the careful grace of her hands, it all seemed to radiate a purity that stood in violent contrast to the cynicism he had cultivated for so long. In an almost unconscious gesture, Helena reached for a worn book from a small shelf near the fireplace, the same books they had once studied together. She ran her fingers lightly over the faded cover, then opened it with hesitation, struggling to decipher the words. The sight of this simple, achingly beautiful scene struck Leonardo with a force he could not deny. In that moment, he saw all the battles Helena fought against the world and against herself, and also the ones he had long avoided within himself. For a fleeting moment, everything inside Leonardo screamed at him to go to her, to break the silence, to tear down the walls he had built. But the fortress of fear, pride, and broken promises was too high. Silently, he retreated, his footsteps swallowed by the darkened corridor, carrying with him the weight of a decision he knew he could not postpone much longer. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and Helena, unaware of the gaze that had watched her so intently, continued her solitary struggle to conquer the world through words. Little did she know that, as her innocent fingers traced the contours of the letters, she was also unknowingly drawing the map of a destiny that would soon force both of them to choose between fear and surrender. The rain fell relentlessly that night, drawing trembling lines across the tall stained glass windows of the mansion, and filling the silence with its continuous, almost hypnotic sound. Helena, exhausted after a tense day of work, retreated early to her small room tucked away at the back of the property. She tried in vain to read one of the books Leonardo had once recommended, but the letters blurred before her tired eyes. The weight of solitude and doubt crushed her in silent waves, making concentration impossible. Each unread page was like a blank page of her own emotions, indecipherable and aching. On the other side of the mansion, Leonardo stared at the storm through the glass wall of his office, his mind as turbulent as the sky outside. He had tried to ignore the growing emptiness, tried to bury himself in work, tried to push Helena from his mind with the same coldness he used to keep anything threatening his internal order at bay. But it was useless. Her image, so vivid, so fragile and strong at once, would not leave him. That young woman, with her silent courage and fierce innocence, had infiltrated the cracks of the armor he had spent a lifetime constructing. In an impulse he would never have allowed himself under normal circumstances, Leonardo left his office and wandered aimlessly. His footsteps echoed through the empty halls, blending with the sound of the rain. Before he realized it, he found himself standing before Helena's door. For long minutes, he remained there, motionless, his hand suspended mid-air, battling the overwhelming urge to knock. He needed to see her, even if just to confirm that what he felt was real, that it wasn't merely the loneliness clawing at his sleepless nights. But before he could decide, a muffled sound from within the room stopped him. It was the sound of stifled sobs, of a sadness so profound it seemed to seep through the walls. Leonardo felt his heart tighten in a way he had never experienced before. Without thinking, he stepped back, retreating from the door with heavy footsteps, his face twisted in silent pain. It wasn't just Helena's suffering that tore at him. It was the brutal realization that he himself was the cause of her pain. That same night, alone in his room, Leonardo faced himself as he hadn't in years. The contract he kept locked in the library's safe, a symbol of his decision never to love, now felt like a rusted chain binding him to an empty existence. Everything he had built, his wealth, his empire, his reputation, suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the simple truth he had refused to admit. He was in love. While the storm raged outside, Leonardo made a decision. He could no longer run. He could no longer allow fear to dictate the course of his life. And above all, he could no longer let Helena drown in sadness without knowing how profoundly she had changed everything for him. The clarity of that realization struck him like a silent bolt of lightning in the night. The dawn would not only bring a new day, it would carry the promise of a gesture that could change everything, or destroy what little fragile connection remained between them. The sun rose timidly that morning, breaking through the dark clouds with pale beams that barely managed to illuminate the vast grounds of the Montenegro estate. The world seemed suspended on a delicate line between past and future, between what had been and what could still be. Leonardo, standing before the large mirror in his bedroom, adjusted his tie with mechanical movements, though his mind was far away. The eyes staring back at him were not the same as days before. They now held a raw vulnerability, a decision painfully matured over a sleepless night. He knew what he needed to do. He knew it was no longer enough to protect himself with cold words, or the illusion of control. For the first time, Leonardo recognized that what he felt was stronger than the fear that had long ruled him. But he also knew that, to reach Helena, he would need to step down from the pedestal where he had hidden all his life. He would have to strip away his armor, his invisible contracts, and stand before her simply as a man. Imperfect, flawed, but willing to risk everything. With firm steps, Leonardo walked down the silent corridors. Each meter he crossed seemed to carry the weight of years of avoided choices and buried emotions. The sound of his shoes echoed like a solemn march toward a destiny from which there was no return. He found Helena in the kitchen, helping one of the cooks arrange the newly delivered fruits. The soft morning light caressed her hair, and for a moment, Leonardo simply watched her, allowing himself to imprint that simple, extraordinary image into his memory. When he finally approached, Helena sensed his presence even before seeing him. She turned slowly, and their eyes met. The silent shock of that encounter was immediate. Unspoken questions, unsaid apologies, and unconfessed feelings hung between them like fragile threads. For a moment, they both remained still, as if the slightest movement could shatter the delicate bubble surrounding them. Leonardo took a deep breath, fighting against the tremor threatening his voice, and then, without subterfuge, without the armor of his usual commanding tone, he spoke. He told her he had made a mistake, that in trying to protect himself from love, he had hurt the only person who truly mattered. His words were simple, yet laden with a sincerity Helena never thought she would hear from him. Helena, confused and with her heart racing, listened in silence, hardly daring to believe what she heard. With each phrase, each confession, it was as if another layer of fear and distance was stripped away between them. When Leonardo, his voice trembling, admitted he had torn apart the contract that forbade him to love, something inside Helena broke, not from pain, but from liberation. Tears she tried to contain slid silently down her face, tracing lines of light across her skin. In a hesitant gesture, as if still afraid to believe, Leonardo reached out to touch her face. And when Helena did not retreat, instead leaning softly toward him, he knew that there were no more barriers, no more contracts, no more empty promises, only the raw, wondrous reality of two hearts that, despite everything, had found each other. The kiss that sealed that moment was tender, full of reverence, as if both understood the preciousness of what they were beginning to build. It was not an ending. It was, rather, a beginning, a silent agreement of surrender, of courage, of love. But not all ghosts had been banished. And as Helena and Leonardo allowed themselves, for the first time, to believe in the possibility of happiness, invisible forces began moving in the shadows of their lives, threatening to destroy everything they had so painstakingly begun to create. What began as a quiet morning soon turned into a silent storm, invisible to the eye but devastating to those who could hear the signs. The news arrived at the Montenegro mansion like a poisonous whisper. Members of Leonardo's board of investors, men who had always seen him as an unshakable fortress, had discovered Helena. About the young maid who, without wealth or influence, had dared to capture the gaze and heart of the untouchable magnate. The scandal, still murmured behind closed doors, threatened to become a roar capable of destroying not just Leonardo's reputation, but everything he had built. The threats were subtle, but brutal. Walk away from her or lose support, contracts, respect. Leonardo faced the cold eyes of his advisors in that secret meeting, and for the first time in many years, felt not only contempt for others, but also for himself, for having lived so long imprisoned in a world where love was seen as weakness. He left that room with his blood boiling, and a decision pounding with every accelerated heartbeat. He would not bow, not this time. Helena, unaware of the dark currents swirling around her, continued her discreet routine, trying to adapt to the fragile happiness she now dared to feel. Yet it took only one look at Leonardo crossing the garden toward her, his eyes burning with determination, for her to know that something serious was about to unfold. He found her beneath the old oak tree, the gentle wind playing with her hair, and at that moment, Helena saw the man. Not the magnate, not the master, but the man who bore within him the strength and fear of one who had chosen to fight for what he loves. Without caring who might see, Leonardo took her hands into his own. His voice was steady, but his gaze carried the urgency of someone with no time left for half-truths. He told her everything, about the threats, about the losses he would face, about the price of choosing her. But above all, he told her that if he had to lose everything, he would lose it with his head held high, because what he had found in Helena was the only thing that gave meaning to the rest. Helena listened in silence, tears sliding freely down her face, without shame, without fear. She, who had so often been invisible, now found herself the center of a world belonging to someone who could have chosen differently, and yet chose her. When he asked, his voice trembling, if she would stay by his side through the storm, Helena did not answer with words. She simply threw herself into his arms, holding him tightly, clinging to life, to hope, to the promise of everything still to come. What followed was a true silent revolution. Leonardo broke contracts, defied expectations, lost partners, yes, but gained his freedom, gained the chance to build a new life, not rooted in fear, but in courage. In a short time, he transformed his empire, reshaped his world, and alongside Helena, created not just a new home, but a new way of living. At the intimate ceremony, held in the garden where everything had begun, beneath the same old oak tree, Leonardo and Helena exchanged simple, heartfelt vows. There was no ostentation, no masks, only two souls who, despite everything, chose to find each other, to recognize each other, to love each other. And as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of fire and hope, Helena and Leonardo knew, without needing to say it, that the greatest love stories are not written in contracts or protected by fortunes. They are the ones that survive the storm, bloom through the cracks, and against all odds, triumph over the impossible. And even as life moved forward, with its inevitable challenges and battles, they would walk side by side, not as master and servant, not as fugitives from their own fears, but as equals, as accomplices, as eternal allies in the construction of a love that nothing and no one could ever tear apart. If you stayed with us until the end and felt touched by this story as deeply as we did while telling it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the new stories we are preparing with so much care. Leave a like to support our work, and share your thoughts in the comments. We would truly love to hear from you. Your interaction is vital for stories like this to keep reaching you. So like, comment, share, and of course activate the notification bell to be reminded whenever a new emotion is waiting for you here. We'll meet again in the next story.